Someone asks how you're doing. The answer is already out before you've even thought about it. I'm fine. You didn't check in with yourself. You didn't assess the question. The response was automatic, like a reflex, like blinking when something moves too close to your face. And the person asking, they take it, they move on. Because fine is the answer that ends the conversation before it starts. So you say it again the next time, and the time after that, at work, at home, in the parking lot when you run into someone you haven't seen in months. I'm fine. Good. Yeah, just busy. You know how it is. And you're not technically lying. You're functional. You showed up today. You're doing the things. So fine seems close enough to true. But there's something else sitting underneath that word. Something you've gotten very practiced at not saying. Not because you're deliberately hiding it, but because saying it out loud would shift something in the room. It would ask something of the other person. It would make you the one who needs something. And you learned a long time ago that needing something openly comes with a price you'd rather not pay. So instead, you perform fine. You keep your voice light. Your face does what it's supposed to do. You laugh when you're supposed to laugh. You ask them questions so the attention stays on them. You show up just enough that no one worries, but not so much that anyone looks too closely. And it works. People believe you, or at least they don't press. And that feels like winning, because the point was never to be seen. The point was to not be a problem. This didn't start last week. You've been doing this for years, maybe decades. At some point, maybe when you were young, maybe later, you absorbed a lesson that didn't come with words. You learned that other people's comfort mattered more than your honesty, not because anyone sat you down and explained it, but because you felt what happened when you weren't fine and you admitted it. Maybe people got awkward. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they tried to fix you too fast, like you were a problem with a clear solution. Maybe they got irritated that you were struggling again. Maybe your feelings became an inconvenience someone had to manage. So you stopped offering them. You started saying fine instead. And people relaxed. They stopped asking. They stopped watching you with that concerned look. And you learned. Fine makes you easier to be around. Fine keeps things smooth. Fine means you don't ask for anything. For a while, this worked beautifully. You got praised for it even, for being low maintenance, for handling things, for not complaining. People called you strong, resilient, the kind of person who doesn't let things get to them. And that felt good. It felt like evidence that you were doing something right. So you kept doing it. You carried it into every relationship, every job, every family dinner. You became the one people didn't worry about, the stable one, the one who had it together. And people started depending on that version of you. They vented to you because you didn't vent back. They brought their problems because you didn't bring yours. They leaned on your stability because you made it look effortless. And there was something in that for you too. A role, a value, a reason to be kept around. Because if you're the stable one, you're useful. You matter. You're not the person people get tired of. So you kept the show running, even when the truth was something else entirely. But here's the trade you've been making without naming it. On one side, you avoid being a burden. You stay in people's good graces. You keep the image clean. You don't risk anyone deciding you're too much, too needy, too fragile, too complicated. On the other side, you vanish. Not all at once, not in some dramatic, visible way, but slowly, steadily, completely. You become someone people don't actually know, because they only know the you that's fine, the you that doesn't crack, the you that doesn't ask for anything. And that version? It's not real. It's curated. It's the edited cut you've been screening for so long that even you've started to believe it's the only version that exists. The cost doesn't announce itself with sirens. It shows up in how lonely you feel in a room full of people. Because they're not responding to you. They're responding to the performance. And the performance doesn't get tired, doesn't second guess itself, doesn't wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if it's doing anything right. It shows up in how much effort it takes just to be around people.
Because maintaining fine when you're not fine is work. Constant, invisible, grinding work. You're monitoring your face, your tone, your word choice. You're translating everything you feel into something easier to digest. And that takes energy. Every day, every interaction. It shows up in how disconnected you feel from your own life. Because when you spend years answering fine without checking if it's true, you lose the thread. The real answer gets buried so deep you stop being able to find it anymore. Eventually, when someone asks, you genuinely don't know anymore. You've been on autopilot so long the signal's gone dead. Your relationships feel it too. Because intimacy is built on honesty, and you're not being honest. You're being palatable. You're being easy, safe, fine. And people sense it, even if they can't name it. They feel the distance, the flatness, the sense that they're only ever talking to the lobby version of you, never the back rooms. Some of them pull away, some of them stay, but the connection never deepens. It just hovers, stays surface level, polite, functional, but not real. And then there's what it does to how you see yourself. When no one knows you're struggling, you start to believe you shouldn't be struggling. You look around and everyone else seems fine, so you assume they actually are. You become the only fraud, the only one faking it. And your struggles stop feeling legitimate because you've hidden them so thoroughly that even you don't take them seriously anymore. You start thinking, if I can't handle this without falling apart, something's wrong with me. But nothing's wrong with you. You're just human. And humans aren't designed to be fine all the time. But you've been pretending so long, you've forgotten that's allowed.
And this doesn't stay contained to one area. It spreads. At work, you don't tell your boss when you're drowning because you don't want to seem incapable. So you take on more than you can carry and you burn out in silence and no one knows until something breaks. In friendships, you don't say when someone's hurt you because you don't want to make it a thing. So you swallow it and it compounds and eventually the friendship just fades. Not because of the hurt, but because you were never really in it honestly. In relationships, you don't tell your partner when you're struggling because you don't want to be needy. So they think everything's fine and they don't show up the way you need them to, and you resent them for not guessing what you never said. With family, you don't tell them what you actually need because the role they've given you doesn't have room for needs. So you stay the stable one, the fine one, the one who's got it handled, and you feel invisible in the one place you thought you'd be seen. And every time, it feels like the safer choice. Because being fine is predictable. Being fine doesn't ask anything of anyone. Being fine keeps you in control. But control over what exactly? Over how people see you? Over whether they worry? Whether they judge? Whether they decide you're weak or dramatic or too much work? You're managing their experience of you at the expense of your own experience of yourself. And that's not connection. That's not love. That's not being known. That's being tolerated. That's being filed under low maintenance and left on a shelf. The cost isn't theoretical. It's not something you'll pay later. You're paying it now, right now. You've been paying it for years. It's costing you your identity because when you perform fine long enough, you start to believe the performance is who you are. You start to think your value depends on not needing anything, that your worth is conditional on being easy, that the second you stop being fine, you become the problem. And that belief becomes a trap. You can't ask for help because asking for help means admitting you're not fine. And if you're not fine, you're not valuable. You can't be vulnerable because vulnerability means showing the part that's cracking. And if people see that, they'll leave. They'll realize you're not who they thought you were. You can't even rest because resting means you're tired. And if you're tired, the mask is slipping. So you push, you keep going, you keep the show running. That's not living. That's enduring. That's white knuckling. That's dragging yourself through your own life while pretending it's easy. And people don't see it. That's the whole point. They see someone who's handling things, someone who's got it together. But you feel it. You feel the exhaustion of never being allowed to not be okay. You feel the loneliness of being surrounded by people who've never actually met you. You feel the weight of carrying yourself alone because you've never let anyone help. And eventually, you start to wonder, what would happen if I stopped? What if someone asked how I was and I didn't say fine? What if I told them the truth?
Not the cleaned up version, not the one that keeps things comfortable. The real one, the one that's tired, the one that doesn't have it together right now. Would they leave? Maybe. Probably some of them would. But the ones who stay, the ones who don't need you to be fine to love you, those are the people who weren't buying the performance anyway. They could feel the distance. They've been waiting for you to stop. But you won't know until you try. And trying feels like stepping off a cliff because the performance has worked for so long. It's kept you safe. It's gotten you approval. It's protected you from rejection. But it's also kept you completely alone. What makes this so hard to see is that it never feels like a pattern. Every time you say, "I'm fine," it just feels like the easiest thing to say. It feels reasonable, considerate, like you're not making things weird. And maybe in that moment, it is easier, but it's not neutral. Every time you say fine when you're not, you're making a choice. You're choosing the performance over the truth. You're choosing their comfort over your honesty. You're choosing to stay hidden rather than risk being seen. And that choice compounds over years, over hundreds of interactions where you said you were fine when you weren't, over every time you smiled when you wanted to cry, over every moment you held it together when you were falling apart. Eventually, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. You realize you don't know who you are when you're not performing. You realize you've lost access to what you actually feel because you spent so long not checking. You realize you're exhausted and no one knows because the whole point was that no one would know. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start catching yourself, the automatic fine, how fast it comes out, how little you mean it. You start noticing how people react, how they relax when you say it, how they don't dig deeper because they don't have to, because fine is the answer that lets everyone move on. You start noticing how lonely it is, how much of yourself you're keeping locked away, how you've decided that being known is scarier than being fine. And here's the part that lands wrong. You thought the performance was protecting you, but it wasn't making you safe. It was just making you invisible. There's a free guide in the description, 5 patterns that keep you stuck. This is one of them. Not because saying you're fine is always wrong, but because saying you're fine reflexively, compulsively, as a way to avoid being seen, that comes with a cost you're already paying. The guide won't tell you what to do instead. It won't hand you steps or scripts. It just names the patterns clearly enough that you can see them in your own life. And seeing them is enough, because once you see the cost, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, the pattern starts losing its grip. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, the same way it built up. This pattern didn't come out of nowhere. It helped you survive something real. It kept you safe when not being fine meant being a problem, when struggling visibly meant losing approval, when needing something meant being too much. But the cost didn't vanish when the situation changed. It's still here, quiet, steady, showing up in how much energy it takes to keep pretending, and how little room you have left for your own truth, and how lonely it is to be surrounded by people who've never actually met you. You don't have to decide anything right now. You don't have to stop saying you're fine tomorrow. You don't have to change anything. But if you've felt this cost, if you've noticed the exhaustion, if you've caught yourself performing when no one asked you to, if you've realized that no one actually knows you because you've been too busy being easy, then you've already started seeing it. And once you see it, the recognition doesn't leave. It doesn't demand anything, but it doesn't let you pretend anymore either. If you want to, you can leave a single sentence below. Not an explanation, just one moment where you said you were fine and you weren't. And even if you say nothing, the recognition will keep working. Whenever you're ready to keep observing, you know where to find the space.